Welcome back to Boilers Extra. I am Nathan Baird from the Indy Star,
Sam King from the Journal and Courier.
and we are talking dual sports today. We haven't talked to you in a couple weeks, actually, and we need to catch you up on the start of spring football, which just started on Tuesday. We're recording this Wednesday, so they may have had their second spring practice before you hear this because they practiced Thursday morning. But we're going to talk about what we saw on that first day and which things that we saw that first day, because it's the first day of spring and this roster is going to change. But what did we see that we think actually matters and could matter this fall? But first, we're going to talk basketball because that's the most urgent thing that's happening right now. I think the last time we recorded a podcast, they were still in the midst of a 4-game losing streak, and they've come out of that with back-to-back wins. They beat UCLA last Friday, and they really beat Rutgers on Tuesday on senior night. And I thought, Sam, that UCLA game, it's weird to call a regular season game that has no implications other than a team trying to get it the top 4 in the Big Ten tournament a must win. But I felt like it was almost a must win for their psyche. And the Rutgers game, in another way, was probably a similar dimension because that's a team that Purdue should dominate and did. And I thought that was back-to-back performances of finding a way to beat a really good team and somewhat convincingly. Definitely the last 10 minutes were Purdue's, and then really putting away a bad team. That is at least a step back in the direction of being that team that they were from January through mid-February.
Right, absolutely. And even, if you want to go further back, the way that Purdue started this season came out, kind of hell's fire and hitting a lot of shots, burying teams from the 3-point line. And then I don't want to say went through a lull because they played some of the best teams in the country there in December. And, there's no fault in losing some of those games. But the Penn State game stood out there. Obviously, there were some other concerns when you just saw, the sheer lack of competitiveness against a team like Auburn. But you feel like this team turns a corner, and then the 4 losses stack up. And, I don't think they're bad losses. Matt Painter even said after beating Rutgers,
the Indiana game was a bad loss. The other 3 weren't.
He said we were competitive in all those games, which I kind of, they were competitive to the end in each of those games. But the way that second half went against Indiana,
you can't get outscored 28-3 in any stretch. Maybe by Auburn or one of those teams, not by Indiana, not even in their gym. Sorry, but go ahead.
Yeah, very much so. And I think that we kind of even said that, like, that UCLA game felt like a must win just because Purdue had to prove it was still kind of on that level. And UCLA is a pretty good team, a team that's on par with Purdue in the middle of the Big Ten teams this year, middle of the pack Big Ten teams. So it was good to see Purdue have some resolve because it did see a 10-point lead evaporate and fell behind there midway through the second half, and then kind of went on its run there at the end of the game to put UCLA away. And to see that carry over to the Rutgers game, where early on it was really back and forth, and then Purdue had a nice little response to an 8-point possession. And I thought that I asked Matt Painter this.
That's not a typo. That's not a verbal typo. 8-point possession.
I asked Matt Painter after the Indiana loss. I said, your team has always had resolve and kind of had a response when things got tough the last couple of years. And he said, yeah, and that was the most disheartening thing at Bloomington was Purdue did not have any sort of fight or any sort of resolve when it got kicked in the face. And so it was good to see that kind of come back here in these last couple of games and kind of stand up and respond to adversity.
Yeah, I thought you saw the negativity that they were probably feeling and hearing after the first 3 losses manifest itself when things went downhill at Indiana, and they just couldn't stop that boulder, and all of a sudden it was crushing them. And they get a break. Much publicized, Trey Kaufman-Wren calls a players-only meeting, gets some guys' heads straight. I guess I shouldn't say it's just some guys. I mean, gets everybody's head straight. Says they have some great practices, and that leads into that UCLA game. And I think you're right that was a good example of things started to go wrong again, and they corrected it. Like they course corrected mid-game. They even took something that was killing them at the time, which was offensive rebounding, and flipped it. And then they dominated the boards in the second half and made that the strength of the night. And that was something that we have not seen them do. And UCLA is not as good top to bottom, especially playing away from the Pacific time zone. as Michigan State is, or really probably even Wisconsin, maybe even Maryland, Michigan. Like, I don't put them in that tier, but they're still a really good team. And that was definitely a losable game in the way it was going. And to reverse course in the middle of the game and then kind of win it with some comfort at the end, I thought was probably from just a relief standpoint, because I started to feel it around this team. We've seen just some individual, we were seeing it on the field, or sorry, the court with see, we get caught between sports. We see it on the court with some of the mannerisms and body language. We were seeing it just kind of being around the team, I thought, or feeling it. Like there was just a tension. And because the Big Ten, at the start of that 4-game losing streak, they're leading the Big Ten. They're they control their own destiny to win a third straight championship. Only been done twice in the history of the Big Ten before that, and it all fell apart. And I think that condition was really just sort of, you could just feel it around this team. And I thought that you felt a little bit of that dissipate with the way that UCLA game went. And I thought that was important, because I thought if they had lost that UCLA game, especially if they lost it in the same fashion that they had been losing games, and they probably still beat Rutgers because Rutgers is bad. But I think it could have extended that negativity into this final week of the regular season, heading off into the postseason, where you still have a lot of attainable goals.
Yeah, very much so. And after that, I think it was maybe even after Michigan State, Fletcher Lawyer said something like, we still have March. The Big Ten is probably not a realistic goal at this point, but there's still a lot to play for. And and he said it again, I believe, after the Indiana game. That told me that this team could kind of get in that right mindset again, where, okay, you put a lot of, when you're a team that's ranked in the top 10 for the last 3 years, you set high goals. And, when they don't happen, you cross those out and say, okay, what's the next thing that we can accomplish? And now that kind of turns to next week. You have to play, this game Friday is really tough at Illinois. Tough way to regular season, tough matchup for Purdue, I think. But I think that Purdue now kind of sets its sights on, if it can win the Big Ten tournament, how that can kind of parlay into a higher seed in the NCAA, how you can get some positive momentum going forward. At playing in Indianapolis, you're going to have a lot of Purdue fans there. But first and foremost, you just need to see the positives from UCLA, from Rutgers, carry into Champaign on Friday night.
Yeah, I actually think winning at Illinois on Friday might have a bigger impact than what happens in the Big Ten tournament, because the farther you get into that weekend, it just seems like people are pretty settled, unless there's a big upset somewhere else, or unless maybe if you ran the table and won it, that would earn you the difference between being the worst four to being the best four to the worst three, if people know what I'm saying there as far as the seed line. Like that, I guess, could happen. But I think Friday is an important game. This is a game that jumped off the schedule at us when that was released over the summer, because when you're thinking that this is going to be a tight Big Ten championship race, and it could come down to the last game of the season, theoretically, when you see that Purdue has to go to Champaign, and you think Illinois is going to be pretty good this year too, coming off of an Elite Eight run, you're thinking, wow, that's not ideal for Purdue to have to go win in that gym against a pretty good team, a good coach, in the final game of the season. And now it instead serves for both of these teams who didn't have the regular season that they wanted to, the Big Ten season that they wanted to. It feels kind of like a catapult into next week if they can pull one off. For Purdue, also, we should say that they do have some incentive. They want that double bye. Maryland won at Michigan tonight before we recorded this. That puts some pressure on Purdue, because if they lose, that drops them down to 7 losses. And then they're going to need Maryland to get upset by, who is it they finished with?
Northwestern, I think.
Yeah, Northwestern. Wisconsin is beating Minnesota as we speak, as you would expect. And then I think they finish with Penn State. So Wisconsin's not going to fall down to 7 losses, I don't believe. So, and even if they did, Purdue would lose that tiebreaker. So they need to, the worst, they need to finish with the same number of losses as Maryland because they will win that tiebreaker, having beaten them 1-0. But I feel like there's something at stake Friday. I don't feel like it's just playing out the string. I think to especially for this team, and I think you wrote some about this, not just from a shooting perspective, but just overall play away from Mackey Arena, as you might expect, has been more inconsistent. And if you can go into State Farm Arena and beat a team that has the talent that Illinois has, even if it's inconsistent, I think that is to go in with a 3-game losing streak feels differently than a 3-game winning streak feels different than even playing well and losing on Friday night.
Yeah, and Illinois is the best rebounding team in the Big Ten, which at times has been not Purdue's strength. It's done better. It did better in the second half, and against both UCLA and Rutgers. But that's a cause for concern a little bit. And full disclosure, when I did my preseason Big Ten selections and sent that stuff in, I picked Purdue as the number 1 team in the Big Ten, and I picked Illinois second. And when I did that, I was really looking at it like, I think Illinois top to bottom probably has more athleticism, more talent. And I just didn't think it would be consistent enough to win the league. As it turns out, Purdue also was not consistent enough to win the league. But Illinois at times has looked like the best, at least offensively, the best team in the Big Ten. It just hasn't been there every single night. But you've seen a team that goes out and bludgeons Michigan, goes to Indiana and just wallops that team. And it turns out that Indiana's turned the corner a little bit as of. I think that Illinois is a really dangerous team matchup-wise for Purdue on Friday night for a lot of reasons.
I mean, frankly, there's some similarities to Purdue's season in that we've seen them go out and, like you're saying, like really torch some people. But then when you get on the field against, did it again, when you get on the court against a elite team like an Auburn, the way that Illinois just did against Duke and just got crushed in like a historic fashion. They don't look always up to par, but then they will get on the court against a team like Alabama and it looks a lot better. So, but they're both of these teams, I think I look at them as having a wide range of variance going into the NCAA tournament eventually. And the idea of Illinois being like an 8 or 9 seed potentially right now, that's not who I want to see in the second round. Right. If I'm a 1 seed like that, I don't like. That's just, it's a team that has, they've had a good chunk of transfers come in too, but it was a program that was just in the Elite 8 last year. Like they know what they're doing as far as the NCAA tournament, and I think they'd be pretty comfortable in that matchup potentially, just from the season that they played. But you touched on rebounding, and I wanted to kind of go factor by factor over a couple of things to talk about what we've seen the last 2 games and what we think is real and what we are still skeptical about, because they've done some really good things in these last 2 games, but you have to have the perspective of who they played, where they played. All of that has to be taken with how you're analyzing what we've just seen, and especially considering now you have played your last game in Mackey Arena. You're going to have to go into a hostile environment on Friday. You're going to have to go into a somewhat comfortable place in Indianapolis, and then who knows where after that. So let's start with the rebounding, because like we said, in both of the last 2 games, they have struggled on the defensive boards in the first half, or maybe it's chicken before the egg, or 6 of one, half dozen of the other. I mean, the other team is doing a good job winning the offensive boards and getting a lot of second chance points. And it was really the reason why they weren't up by more against UCLA at halftime, and the same against Rutgers. They had some big advantages against Rutgers in the first half, especially what did they shoot in the first, like 10 of 16 from 3, just something.
Just something 10 of 15 stupid. From 3, and I think that the team was like 76% overall in the first half.
It was unreal, but yet they were only up by relatively not that much. What was it, like a 9-point game
at halftime?
Yeah, so. and a lot of it was like, I think they gave up 9 second chance points in the first half off of like 7 offensive boards or something like that. And then in both of the last 2 games, they flipped it. It was Camden Heide doing a lot of that work against UCLA. It was Caleb First doing a lot of that work against Rutgers. So where would you put rebounding right now as do you feel like this has been a sign that this team has made strides in rebounding, or are you still skeptical that against especially a team like Illinois that rebounds like crazy, or outside of Mackey Arena, outside of having some advantages like that, this is still going to be a struggle for Purdue, and maybe the thing that could could end the season?
I believe that this will be something that forces Purdue, at some point will have to really grind out a low scoring game, and that will be the difference. And that, if I'm a Purdue fan, kind of scares me a little bit. Now, I think Trey Kaufman-Renn did phenomenal against Rutgers. He's a guy who, at times, being your center, you would expect should get 8 boards, almost every single night. And Purdue fans probably got spoiled by Zach Edey just gobbling up everything that came off the rim for the last few years. And then before that, you had Swanigan and Travion Williams. So you really have always had this luxury of, kind of a great rebounding guy in there, and Isaac Haas even before that. So now you have to really fight. You have to box out. You have to do a lot of the things, as they're designed to be done to get those boards. And you are able to, rely on Cam Heidi's athleticism at times, but it's not like that's consistent. Caleb first had a little bit of a run there where he was doing very well on the boards, and then he kind of vanished during that losing streak in that respect. So it's got to be there every single night. And I don't know that Purdue can be that way with, really a lineup that at some point is not going to be the biggest lineup on the floor after being so used to always being the biggest team on the court.
You mentioned the late Biggie Swanigan in there, and I think that it's a really interesting comparison because this team has no one who can rebound like Caleb Swanigan, but it needs to have guys who want to rebound like Caleb Swanigan. And I don't think they've always had that. I've told the story before of interviewing Caleb Swanigan about rebounding and making some kind of comment about how he's practically taken the ball away from his teammates. And I'll never forget his answer. Like, there are no teammates in rebounding. Like, you are out there to get the ball at all costs. And I think you have seen that mindset eventually snap in each of the last 2 games. But I do not think it was there in the first half of either of these last 2 games. And Cam Heidi admitted it. He said he came in the halftime thinking that he had played that was his word, a soft first half, and had let this team down from a rebounding standpoint, was not being aggressive enough. And to use the Paynerism, embracing the physicality of the game. And Matt Painter came in the post game and off the top of his head was like, oh yeah, there were 3 times, and he could name it. He didn't even know Camden Heidi had said that, but he could pick out 3 different times where he thought that was true. And then Camden Heidi goes out and gets it in his blood and goes out and takes care of business in the second half. They've got to start doing that more in the first half. That's got to be something that happens at the start of games. Rewarding yourself defensively. This team is not good enough defensively to not reward itself defensively with rebounds. And it's tricky because they are not built to rebound, but it's going to have to be an effort thing. And as you get into an NCAA tournament scenario, you just cannot give – every team you play is going to be good, especially with the seed that Purdue is probably going to end up with. And nobody at Purdue can take any seed for granted anymore. But they can't give those teams extra possessions, and the turnovers kind of come and go. But if the rebounding is the thing that I think is always something they have to overcome. And I think it's a good sign that they've done it in the second half. I'm really curious what it looks like from the start against Illinois, because maybe it's a thing where you rise to the level of the competition. I'm sure it's going to be a huge emphasis from the time they got done playing Tuesday night until the time they tip off on a Friday. They'll probably be talking about it on the bus on the way there or something. Rebounding is going to be the way they can have a chance to win that game on Friday. And I think that can be a potential, even if regardless of the outcome of the game, I think if you go in there and equalize the physicality of the rebounding against Illinois, that is a important step for this team going into whatever day it starts playing in the Big Ten tournament.
Yeah, absolutely. And man, this is 2 years in a row now. Purdue went there for Illinois senior night a year ago, and
it's gotten chippy, hasn't it? Has it gotten a little chippy?
These 2 fan bases have been going after each other. Braden Smith told me, not during an interview, just kind of casual conversation. Maybe it was during the NCAA tournament last year, where you can kind of get more personality out of these guys, where you're not just interviewing them, you're just kind of standing around talking. And he said Illinois was the craziest fan base that he played in front of last year. Fittingly for him, I guess he hit the 3 that won the game, and then did the night thing, and that didn't endear him to that fan base either. So I expect this to be, probably going to be, other than maybe Indiana, the most hostile environment that this team has played in. And the Indiana environment wasn't that hostile until things started to kind of matriculate there early in the second half, and that fan base really kind of got behind the team then.
I think Breslin is an underrated tough place to play from a fan base, just because that student section just rings the whole court. It's a tough environment, and they're always good. Like, it's just a tough place to try to win. But State Farm Center, I still want to call it Assembly Hall, because I grew up half an hour from there, watching the Flying Illini and all those guys. But yeah, I think it's still a good final regular season game for Purdue. I think they would rather in these circumstances, yes, they have to win and have a tangible reason to want to win because of that double bye. So maybe they'd rather be playing another kind of gimme game, but this team still has some things it probably wants to prove to itself, and this is a good way to do it. So, but I think you're probably on the same page as me that, like, the rebounding right now, it's a good sign what they've done the last two games, but I don't know that it means anything until they get the next time they get on the court, and they're going to do it Friday. But then the next time after that, when they're on the court against a team that is a really, really strong rebounding team, how do they kind of find a way to equalize that, not let that be the reason why they're giving up so many extra possessions that they can't?
I also think
out
that
the hole.
On Tuesday, I feel like Rutgers just rolled over and died. And,
Rutgers is so bad.
It's a team. They were in it for a while, and it's a team with a losing record that's got these two basically Ferraris who are freshmen who are going to be lottery picks or high draft picks in the NBA draft next year. But once Purdue started making the shots, it seemed like Rutgers was like, just lost all concepts of what it should do and chucking up bad shots and things of that sort, and really allowing Purdue to get long rebounds and runouts and things of that, and make the score as lopsided as it ultimately became.
Rutgers was one of the three double plays that Purdue had this year. It was Michigan, who they split with, Indiana, who they split with, and then they sweep Rutgers. But Rutgers could end up being a big factor if Purdue does get the double bye, because if they win on Friday, that ensures them, I think, of getting fourth, because they can do no worse than tie with Maryland. The only team in Big Ten play that's worth anything, I think, that Rutgers beat was they beat Maryland back on like January 3rd. And if without that game, this is a different season for Purdue. They might already be looking at right now being out of a top four spot. Let's talk about some of the bench production, and especially from a shooting standpoint, because there's been sort of a back and forth. It started early in that losing streak with that game at Michigan, where I thought, Matt Painter was arguing, well, the guys we wanted took the highest volume of shots and they were efficient. That's what you want. And I thought that was a case where, against a really good team, if the other six guys are so inefficient, that might mean that's how you lose by 2 points. And over the course of a season, that's probably, you're going to take that more often than not, and you'll just take the 2-point losses once in a while. But I thought what you've seen the last couple games, just on an individual basis, it started with Miles Colvin hitting some shots at Indiana in a game that they lost. Camden Heide has hit some shots. Jakar Harris hit some shots, including the big 4-point play against Rutgers. All these guys who all season long, we've been kind of tracking these funks that they're in. And I asked Cam Heide about this when we talked to him before the game. We talked to him on Monday, and he said something in an answer about my shooting slump. And I said, does it seem like a shooting slump because you only take like 2 shots a game sometimes? He's like, no, exactly. Like, that's not the right word, because it's not like you are in this prolonged funk. It's just the law of averages on any given night. You took 2. If you had gotten to take 7, maybe you hit 3 of them and you look like a really strong 3-point shooter. So, but you're starting to see those guys capitalize on these somewhat sparse opportunities. And I feel like there is some legitimacy to this, because in all of these cases, except for Jakari Harris being a freshman, but in the case of Miles Colvin, in the case of Camden Heide, we've seen these guys hit shots. Like, they were proven good 3-point shooters at the college level coming into this season. And I feel like the confidence is up for these guys at a good time. It could go away, and sometimes you can take good shots and they don't fall, but it's certainly a beneficial thing for Purdue right now that some of these guys who might only get 15 minutes and might only get a couple of shots on any given night, they're feeling it right now. And if they can sustain that for the next few weeks, we've seen it in Purdue's past, usually more with star players, but like you get the right guys hot at the right time, it can really carry you somewhere.
Yeah, and I would think that Purdue fans probably have this fear of whatever happened to Ethan Morton between his sophomore and then the rest of his career, his sophomore season and the rest of his career, where he was shooting 40% from three and then just couldn't hit a three to save his life, and became really just a defensive player towards the end of his career. But that's an outlier probably in terms of guys who shoot a high volume. Jakari Harris, I asked him specifically after the Rutgers game because he's shooting 40% from three since the calendar turned to 2025. And he was shooting something like, he's still only shooting like 28% from three, which tells you how bad he was for the first half of the season. He was at somewhere like 18%. And I think he's going to be a guy that can factor in big. There's been games where he doesn't even take a shot. And I think that's where Purdue probably needs these guys more than others, is just to be threats. And I thought Jakari Harris, that 4-point play, he was obviously got fouled on it. So he was being guarded pretty tightly and still had the
he's pretty much falling down as he hit the shot.
Yeah, the confidence to fire that shot up. And at times I felt like whoever's, CJ Cox, even Fletcher Lawyer at times, but some of these guys, Cam Heidi is one who's been singled out, have been hesitant to shoot when they have the shot. They'll pump fake or they'll, try to pass it off for a better shot. When earlier this season, real early in the year, when I asked Matt Painter about this, he said, man, you shoot 40%, let it rip. Like you catch the ball in your sweet spot, just fire it up. And if it doesn't go in, we'll live with it. But don't pass it up. And then we end up getting a turnover or something like that, and the other team capitalizes on it. So, Miles Colvin's never been a guy that I feel like he's going to take the shot if he's got any, window to a clear side of line to the basket. And it's good to see Jakari Harris kind of come into that. And I think these other guys, if they do that and be more aggressive, that can be a big benefit, just posing as threats, even if the shots don't go in.
Let's talk turnovers, because I feel like that's the other bugaboo that's kind of hung around out there all season for Purdue. And they had 9 each in the last 2 games. But I think the thing that stood out, and I especially noticed this against UCLA, was that they weren't the backbreakers. They weren't the pick six turnovers. They weren't, they would travel, or they would throw the ball out of bounds or wildly. They weren't just giving it to the other team to start a fast break. And I think that Purdue, by the nature of some of the things it wants to do, you're trying to get the ball in the post so much. You've got some guys out there who are not offense first players. Like you're going to have to deal with some turnovers. I think it's just the nature of the turnovers. If they can find a way to not be having backcourt turnovers that the other team gets to just take and cash in on, the way they were in 3 of those 4 losses, at least during that losing streak, they're going to give themselves a chance. It's one of the other things I'm still very skeptical about, though, and I don't know that Friday is going to tell us a lot. Illinois, I think, ranks maybe last in the country, or one of the lowest in the Ken Pom turnover rating on defense. Like, I don't think they just don't really create a lot of turnovers. Doesn't seem like. And so this might be the kind of team that doesn't really come into play so much on Friday night. They do have to worry much more about the rebounding side of things. But I also feel that if you're Purdue and you can just kind of hang from a rebounding standpoint, and then you don't turn the ball over, you would usually expect that to be like an 80, 85 point night. And a lot of nights that's going to be enough to win.
Yeah. And this really very well could be a shootout. The way these 2 teams at times have shown that they can shoot and score. The turnovers at times that seem to be costly. And Braden Smith's going to turn the ball over by the nature of being a point guard and, possessing the ball as much as he does and being the best player on the team. You're going to get harassed with all these different defensive looks. He's got in trouble at times where he's just, sometimes probably trying to force things, but other times I think he's throwing to a spot where the guy is typically open and a team just reads it well or whatever, or pokes a hand out. I think that happened in the Rutgers game early. He just turned around and threw it right to a Rutgers guy standing behind him and was almost kind of like he's not supposed to be there. But yeah, if you can eliminate those, I think that you can't play just cautiously and not try to be yourself. But you can't afford to, with the way, Purdue, as you mentioned, is not a great defensive team, just give away points. I thought that's where the Michigan State game really got out of hand, was those turnovers ended up being wide open layups and dunks on the other end pretty consistently.
And Indiana was doing it to him too at some point. Like it's been a backbreaker at times. We don't have to bring up, but we can. I guess we can. Marquette, Penn State. Penn State still being one of the worst losses any of the best teams in the Big Ten took this year, when you consider they were down by 27 with under 10 minutes to play or whatever it was. So we've seen it be a catastrophe. And if it reaches catastrophe levels again in the NCAA tournament, then your NCAA tournament's over. Like, I don't know that they can overcome that, especially when they're not gonna win rebounding to a degree that compensates for that. They're probably trying to break even on the boards against most teams, and if you're then giving away a bunch of points with turnovers, I think that's just the recipe for the end of a season. I am, not to jump too far ahead of ourselves, like a whole 9 months or whatever, 6 months, but I looking ahead to next season, assuming everybody comes back, and right now that's the trajectory we think this team is on.
At least all the people seeing minutes.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Other than Caleb First and anybody farther down on the roster, that the world is what it is these days. But among the rotation guys, like if Daniel Jacobson could come in and play clean, and you're going to deal with some turnovers from post guys, and he's didn't get to have the first season he wanted. Sounds like he's progressing well, but like if he can come in and play clean minutes from a turnover standpoint in the post, that could be a much more consistent thing for this team next year, that it plays without turning the ball over as much. But just something to kind of keep in mind, I think, on the horizon. I think that's a potentially promising thing, especially when they're going to be playing then some small ball lineups still with Cam Heide or whatever to play off of that. But anything else on your mind from a basketball standpoint before we switch over to Barry Odom's first spring?
I would just say the shooting from the outside, 50% over the last 2 games, 50% each in the last 2 games. You hope that becomes kind of, you're not going to shoot that high of a clip every night, but the 40+% from 3, I think, is Purdue's best chance of making a run in the NCAA tournaments, coupled with obviously what Trey Coppman can do. But there's been some games that Purdue's just kind of vanished. I was kind of surprised when I looked it up. Some of its worst shooting games of the year from 3, at Rutgers, 4 of 24, versus Indiana at Mackey Arena was like 2 of 13 or something, and then 3 of 9 against Ohio State at Mackey Arena, and Purdue won 2 of those games. So yep. It can win in different ways, but I think that its best chance to make a run is to shoot well from 3. And, I don't think they have to shoot 36 times, whatever it was. I guess it was 36 times against Rutgers. But you probably want to be comfortable in that, taking 20 attempts a game from out there and shooting at a 40% clip to set yourself up.
I mean, if teams give Fletcher Lawyer and Braden Smith like 25 3-point attempts in a game, and they make
that team's not going to win.
But that's the other thing. That's why I still have some, as far as like them being able to sustain that team wide. UCLA is a good defensive team. That was a positive thing, the way they shot the ball there. Rutgers, that was a voyeur defense that they were playing out there for most of that game. That was they were just sort of nodding in the direction of playing defense. I don't know how Fletcher Lawyer got that many wide open shots. There was one point in the second half where he had like almost a completely wide open shot, but he still passed the ball over to Jakari Harris because he had an absolutely wide open shot, which actually probably from a percentage standpoint, you'd probably still rather just Fletcher Lawyer take it. I just thought that was funny in the moment. But they got to have Rutgers from that game told me, I thought it was much more important that they played cohesively. And I thought it was important that some of the guys who don't get to shoot the ball 10, 12 times a game are hitting threes right now. Like I said before, like if they get into a stretch where that 40% is enhanced by Harris and Heide and Colvin and whoever else, CJ Cox, even though he starts, he doesn't shoot a high volume of shots. But when those guys are plugging in one apiece over the course of a game, like that really adds up. And if those guys go over on a handful of attempts, that can add up too. So I think that's from a 3-point perspective, that's what I'm kind of focused on as this team goes into postseason play. Let's talk football. First spring practice on Tuesday morning. I want to say up front, um, thank you to Barry Odom and his staff. Right now, we are getting to watch the entirety of spring football practices. It's not open to the public the way it was back during the Darrell Hazel era, but it is right now from a media standpoint. We can only show you photos and videos from certain periods. That's industry standard, but we're getting to watch the entire practice. And even though it's just spring, and even though this roster is going to change again before August, I think we're still it's good to just see how this staff operates. It's good to be able to interact with the staff a little bit, and not that we're not really so much during practice, obviously. And then it's good to just kind of start to get a real sense of the personnel. And I don't want to make too much of things that we saw on day one, but I think there's some things that we saw that they don't mean everything, but they don't mean nothing. And was there anything like that that jumped out to you from day one, Sam?
I think the thing that stood out to me more than anything, and granted, with the way that things ran in the past, we would be there for 20 minutes at the start of practice, leave, and then we would be invited back into the practice facility once they were done. So you're really at the mercy of what the coaches tell you happened.
Yep.
Being able to see it firsthand, just the pace and the organization that this, for being a first spring practice 3 months after these guys got here, for the players being here only really 2 months, I thought it looked phenomenal from that standpoint. Just the structure of everything, the pace, the way that it seemed like everything had a purpose and was kind of in sync. And I was talking to Brandon Lee, the general manager, who played for Barry Odom at Missouri. And he said, yeah, he's a Barry Odom is a disciplinarian, holds you accountable, and you are going to do things his way. And I thought it was very evident that the team already, even though it hasn't been out there on a practice field yet, looked very structured and organized.
I think you're right, and other people who watched had that impression. We were talking to Gus Hartwig today after Pro Day. He had that impression of watching those guys, like the way they were bouncing around. He didn't really make it in terms of the comparison, but for those of us who don't have allegiances, we can make the comparison. But I also think it's one of those things that's probably going to get spun as like a comparison to the way Ryan Walters did it. And to me, it's still more like, well, Purdue chose to have a guy who had never done this before, and now they've chosen to have a guy who has done it a whole bunch of times at this level, at a successful rate, at a couple of stops. So it should look more like this to me. It should look cleaner. It should look more purposeful as the way they're bouncing around. So yeah, but no, I definitely came away from that. Barry Odom is right out there in the middle of it, bouncing around to various things that are going on. We saw a lot of like offensive periods. I don't know how to say it. Like, it wasn't a lot of drill work. It was a lot of, and maybe they just did this for the first day to let guys play some football, but I just thought it was a lot of, route running and, 7-on-7 kind of things and some 11-on-11 stuff. Obviously they're not live right now, but you had each of the five scholarship quarterbacks are rotating through different groups and getting a lot of reps that way. Barry Odom had talked about that. That's why they wanted to shake the trees for some walk-ons to add to the secondary and the offensive line, because they wanted to be able to practice that many groups at one time and just keep those reps going. And I hoped that I would go in and see something from a quarterback standpoint that just blew me away. I didn't, but there was some good and some bad, as you would expect. But late in the practice, they went to a 2-minute drill period, and Malachi Singleton was the first quarterback of what looked like the number one offense for the first period of that, the first group of that. And again, I don't think that means everything, but I don't think it means nothing, especially when you're talking about it's a transfer. It's not like they're deferring to someone like Ben Meredith, who had already been here. It's one of the 3 transfers that's coming in, and he has pushed himself for whatever reason. They picked him on the first day to lead the first group. I think it means something. I think it means at the very least that they have seen probably positive things from him, not just athletically, but in other ways that they feel like it is okay to put him out front, because I think coaches are wary of doing that, of giving someone some putting someone in that position who they don't think that the team respects. And I think it's a good sign that all these guys, they followed up with other guys who were transfers too in those other groups, but putting someone like that out front, it's just a good sign early on for him, probably. And now we'll see just how this unfolds over. I wouldn't expect to know who the starting quarterback is by the end of the spring, but I'm glad that we're going to get to actually watch how this unfolds in person.
Yeah. And, I try not to get too high or too low off of what we see in practice. I fell into that trap last fall and thought some of these players were maybe a little bit better than they ended up being once it translated to game days. Two things that I thought were great to see for Purdue's prospectus going forward was George Burhan, who missed basically all of last year, was out there as the number one tight end, and he looked good. He looked like the high-level prospect guy that came here 2 years ago to Purdue. And CJ Madden, I asked, he's telling us about his ankle that injured him last year. He played about 60 snaps total all of last season. And I said, "Are you 100% now?" And he said, "No, I'm 110%," which tells me, I know that's not a thing, but he feels really great. Like he's mobile and back to his normal self right now. So that is big for the defense.
Yeah. I came in last preseason and Madden kind of got nicked up right away. I can't remember what that first injury was, something lower body, I think. And then, but he was back out there doing walkthrough reps, and then started the season, played the first 3 games, gets hurt, I think against Oregon State, and is just done for the year. Ends up having to have surgery on his left ankle.
Yeah.
And what I thought was interesting was that at a time when so many of the other transfers who came in and were expected to have an impact are now already gone. Like some of those other guys who came in from Georgia, guys who came in from other big schools, they were one and done, and they're off to sometimes their third or fourth or however many destinations that they're on now. And CJ Madden not only stayed, but it really feels like he is a leader on this team right now. And there was certainly a vacuum that's created when guys like, Thieneman and Claire and Helt and your starting quarterback is out of eligibility, like, and the other guy who started for you a little bit transfers. Like there's a void there that somebody had to fill, but it sounds like he very organically has done that by just the way that he's practicing. And I think that is, or not just practicing, but the winter workouts. Because I had asked Kiro Small, who we got to talk to Tuesday, the head of strength and conditioning, like who were the guys who stood out, and the 2 guys he mentioned happened to be the 2 guys we were talking to that day. So maybe he thought they were within earshot, or maybe that's why we were talking to them that day. But it was Ethan Trent, the offensive lineman, and CJ Madden. And this team needs guys like that. This team, it is so critically important for teams to have their best players be their hardest workers. It doesn't have to be, I guess, 100% of them, but if some of your best players are not considered your hardest workers, or your best leaders are not ever on the actual field or court to actually play, it doesn't, the translation doesn't happen. The connection doesn't happen. Here's an example from Purdue history, 2013-14 Purdue basketball, my first year on the beat. Matt Painter's going out of his way to talk about how great of a leader Travis Carroll is, one of the best leaders that they'd had since he had been at Purdue. The problem was Travis Carroll didn't play. Like it was his last year, and he had faded into a farther down in the rotation. And I thought you saw that on the court that year. That team needed leadership, but the guy who could provide the most leadership wasn't one of the best 8 or 9 basketball players and couldn't get out there. If you can take someone like CJ Madden and the talents that he has and have his leadership really kind of inked onto the field, assuming he can stay healthy now, I think that is a big step forward for this team, because it needs to fill the void that the natural leaders who they previously had have departed.
Yeah, and it's worth noting, and I'm not saying anybody's leaving, but this roster is going to change again here in 5 weeks. Some of these guys are going to go in the portal after.
I'll say people are leaving. Like, I don't know who they are yet, but people are leaving.
And
Barry
and
Odom will tell you that too.
there will be players on this roster in the fall who are not currently on this roster. So everything's with a grain of salt right now, but you would expect the guys who are out there competing for what looks like, first and second team reps would be guys that feel like they're going to be contributors in the fall. And the position I probably watched more than anything, I watched the offensive line, but it's hard to really gauge what you're seeing there because everything gets just so stacked up in the middle of the field. I wanted to see the receivers because Purdue lost pretty much everything. Denial on Morissette is back. Jaden Dixon-Veal is back after struggling with some things last year and not being on the field as much as he would have liked. But you have, E.J. Horton is a transfer in here. Nathan Leacock from Tennessee. There's another guy that I'm forgetting right now. And we're still in spring football mode, day one as well.
Who'd you say before Leacock?
Horton, E.J. Horton.
Okay. I know I'm blanking on the guy's name too.
Charles Ross from USC, maybe.
Yes. Charles Ross. Yes.
I just wanted to see the receiver group and how they because everybody's going to talk about the quarterbacks, everybody's going to talk about some of these players, but the receiver was a position that I thought Purdue just stunk it up last year. Didn't really give the team a whole lot of help, and because of that, all those guys are gone for the most part, and a new crop of receivers are here. And I thought, without getting too far ahead of myself, I thought that looked like a position that could be maybe a strength this year. Now, granted, they're playing a defense that's just been put together with a bunch of guys who also are transfers, and definitely isn't a fine-tuned product right now. But just from looking at those guys and the way they were playing, I was like, okay, it just looks different maybe than what I had become accustomed to when we were doing this a year ago.
Well, some of these dudes have at least played. I think that's a step forward. And in some of the guys that they kept, like Denial Morissette, played last year. Like you're keeping some guys who, at least one who got some decent time. And I think experience is just so crucial. It's one thing if a guy was getting on the field and producing it at the places, I have to say places, because a lot of these guys, it's not just from one place that they're coming from. They know what it's like to go out and turn work into production. And again, I'm still very I don't mean skeptical as a negative word. I think it's just, I'm like you, it's got to be a wait and see thing, because we talked last year about, hey, how many of these guys would rank among the top 10 or 12 in the Big Ten at their position? Well, most of the guys that we would have put in that conversation are gone. And so how many of these guys are going to be able to step in right away and be one of the 10 or 12 best players in the Big Ten at their position? Because it's going to take several of them if Purdue's going to have some kind of a successful year right away. But it's also a position where they've got some guys who I think can grow a little bit. I'm still much more intrigued by what this spring means for 2026 almost than I am about what it means for 2025. I was also watching the offensive line, at least just to see how they were stacking guys up. And it's another one that, again, it doesn't mean everything, but if we had taken a guess as to what's the starting lineup going to be on opening day, we probably would have come, our best guess, just based on what guys had done before and experience and things like that, might have been what we saw on Tuesday, which was it was Joey Tonona at left tackle, Jalen St. John at left guard. Now, St. John started at left tackle, I think, each of the last two seasons for UNLV, right? So
Yes.
he's extremely experienced at left tackle. I was a little bit surprised to see him at guard, but I assumed that he would come in and play. I assumed he would come in and start. If you're going to start for 2 years for a team that wins 20 games or whatever, you can come in and start on this Purdue offensive line. Like you're going to start. Giordano Vaccaro, the Canadian, was the first string center, and then Jaden Ball at right guard and Baking Coley at right tackle. And I'm going to call it first string. I probably shouldn't. The coaches would not want me to call it first string, but that thing that looked like the number one offense, that was the number one offensive line. And you've got guys in there. Tonona was around last year, played a little bit. Jaden Ball was around last year, played a little bit. Coley's been around. They only had a few snaps. And maybe right now they're deferring to some of the guys who have been around and have earned a little bit of something there. You've got some guys on the second string, Hank Purvis, comes to mind that they had some experience where they're coming from, but I thought it was interesting that maybe one of the assumptions we would have made is to just who should be in front right now maybe looks like who is in front on the offensive line.
Yeah, and you asked at Pro Day Wednesday, both Marcus Bowe and Gus Hartwig, of the guys that you played with last year, who do you see like maybe taking that next step? And both of them mentioned Bakeen Coley, and I think Gus also mentioned Jaden Ball. So Bakeen's the guy who played a little bit last year, definitely looks the part. Joey Tanona is a guy that I thought this would be the year that was really telling because he hadn't played football in so long before he got on the field last year that you have to go through a season of just playing football again, getting hit, being consistently sore and waking up in the morning and having to treat your body. And so I think this spring and going into the fall probably is more where he'll feel like it's back to what it used to be when he was in high school and before he went to Notre Dame. So he's a guy that had big time promise coming out of high school. And if you can even get a fraction of that, that's going to help this Purdue offensive line.
We're coming up on an hour, so I think we're probably going to shut this down. But anything else that you want to mention from football before we sign off?
No, we'll get our hope is to be more consistent with these. And we probably will be, especially as the Big Ten tournament gets rolling in the NCAA tournament. And then spring football being, 3 times a week here for the next 5 weeks. We'll have a lot to talk about.
The good thing is after Friday, this actually comes into a good pattern. One of the things that we struggle with is the travel. We're on the road. You're trying to squeeze in a day off here and there. We both got young kids and that sort of thing. And then the things just kind of fold into each other. But, we're going to have some kind of a break no earlier than between Friday and Thursday will they play a game. And then after that, you get into the NCAA tournament and we are like sequestered in these cities, and we'll have plenty of time to bring some pods to you, probably on a pretty regular basis once we get into wherever they're at for the NCAA tournament. And I'm sure we'll bring you some kind of pod, probably on Selection Sunday to react to that. But now we're getting way ahead of ourselves. Big game Friday for basketball, NCAA or Big Ten tournament. I think has, as we'll talk about next week, I think there's a different perspective on that this year than maybe there was last year or even the year before that when they won it. But we'll talk about that then. I'm Nathan Bear from Indy Star. He's Sam King. We'll see you later.